Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to the National Archives building and to the culminating event of our series of national conversations. In 2014, I attended a civil rights summit at the LBJ Presidential Library to mark the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The summit brought 4 U.S. presidents, civil rights leaders, scholars, and activists together to discuss the future of civil rights advocacy in America. One of the biggest things to come out of the conference for me was the realization that there is so much more to say about rights and justice 52 years after the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And the idea for the National Conversations was born out of this need to continue these crucial decisions. As a federal agency, the National Archives is responsible for the Charters of Freedom, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and for the collection and protection of 13 billion other records that tell the American story and its continued challenges and successes toward creating a more perfect union. We've chosen the 225th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights to feature an exhibit, Amending America, in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery upstairs. As the permanent home of the Bill of Rights, no institution is better poised than the National Archives to not only celebrate the anniversary of this extraordinary document, but also explore its meaning for civil rights today. We wanted to use this moment to engage Americans in conversations about complicated issues such as class, gender, politics, race, religion, and sexual orientation through the national conversations. The content of the discussions build on the National Archives holdings, connecting key foundational documents to the challenges before us. But our larger goal was more ambitious, to advance discussion of these critical issues in communities across the nation and to bring to the forefront challenges to rights and justice that persist 225 years after the ratification of the Bill of Rights. Over the past year, National Archives locations across the country as well as other cultural institutions have hosted the National Conversations. Our first, concerning civil rights and individual freedom, was held at the Jimmy Carter Library in Atlanta in May. Subsequent conversations concerning LGBTQ, human and civil rights, women's rights and gender equality, immigration, barriers and access, and educational access and equity were held in Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, and Dallas. And now we're here at the National Archives building for our final event, Building a More Perfect Union, an event which will bring all of these conversations together. I want to express our gratitude to our partner, the National Archives Foundation, for supporting this series, and a big thanks goes to our lead sponsors for Amending America, AT&T, as well as the Ford Foundation and Seedlings Foundation, for their belief in and support of the National Conversations. And now it's my honor to introduce Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation.
Good evening, everyone. Allow me to add my welcome to those of you who are here and those watching online. It's a special night. The National Archives Foundation is the private partner to the National Archives. We provide creative and financial support to the Archives endeavors. For the last 2 years, we've championed rights and justice, and through their exhibits, programs, and these conversations, we're especially proud of what the Archives has accomplished. It was made possible with support of a number of donors. David's listed out, staff who will go nameless, but are endless, both here and across the country, the Archives and the National Archives Foundation. But we're especially thankful for AT&T, one of our closest partners, and those who really enabled the Amending America initiative to happen. And tonight I'm pleased to introduce Dennis Dunn, the President of External Affairs of AT&T for Maryland, D.C. and Delaware, to offer his remarks before we begin. Dennis?
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening at our National Archives. I'd like to begin by saying thank you on behalf of AT&T and our employees for allowing us to be part of the Archives Amending America initiative. Over the past year, pioneers and thought leaders in the areas of civil rights, LGBTQ issues, gender equality, immigration, and education have gathered in cities across the country to discuss the progress that has been made, the work that remains, and our collective responsibility to our fellow countrymen. AT&T's more than 141-year history has evolved alongside the moments and the history of our country. From the civil rights movement, to the feminist movement, to marriage equality, to the milestones in our nation's history, AT&T's story is about innovation and people. Our story of innovation has been helped power social change in communities across America, and we look forward to another century of both observing and being part of these movements. Briefly, we would like to draw your attention to our company's history of leadership in support of diversity. AT&T's 50-state workforce is more than 32% female and 43% people of color. Our management is 35% female and 37% people of color. We are a proud member of the Billion Dollar Roundtable, a supplier diversity think tank of corporations that spend more than $1 billion annually with diverse corporations. AT&T also founded one of the country's first employee resource groups. Now we have 12 ERGs with more than 136,000 members focused on professional and personal development, supporting diverse communities, and driving the success of our business. We are truly proud of our company's leadership and our country's progress on these issues. Tonight, we gather with other leaders from across the country to discuss some of the most critical issues Americans face today: the judiciary and civil rights. We will hear from U.S. District Judge, the District of Columbia, Tanyan Chutkan, Representative Jim Clyburn, Cortland Cox of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee Legacy Project, Derek Kayango of the National Civil and Human Rights Center, and civil rights activist Joyce Ladner. Every day, these men and women work to make our country a better place for all its people, a truly noble undertaking. I want to say on behalf of AT&T that there are no better people to be having this conversation with today. Thank you very much, and enjoy this wonderful evening.
And now we're going to view an introductory film featuring Congressman John Lewis, narrated by Cokie Roberts, entitled Amending America.
The Constitution is a living document. It is not static. As citizens, we need to make it real, not just for some of us, but for all of us. The phrase "with liberty and justice for all" mean all. We're one people. We're one family. We're the American family.
The discovery of an individual's liberty is one of the foundational values of being an American citizen. America has been struggling to define the rights and justices associated with that liberty since the creation of its Constitution. From this struggle evolved the monumental Bill of Rights and 17 more amendments to define and protect our liberties. Over time, the amendment process has been tested by a nation whose national sense of liberty, equality, and the inclusion of all citizens evolved with turbulence and struggle.
When we were planning the March on Washington in August of 1963, I would hear Dr. King say things like, "We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters. If not, we will perish as fools."
Freedom, true freedom, is not given by governments. Freedom is taken by the people. The people of America are becoming aware that this freedom to their fellow human beings, and I call them human rights, are theirs to give.
The issues that compel America to continue to define equality and fairness, I think it's innate. I really believe that it's in our soul, that we believe in freedom, freedom of the individual. We believe that humans have a right to peacefully coexist with fellow human beings.
So there are two monumental statues on the Pennsylvania Avenue side of the National Archives building. One inscribed, "Study the past," the other, "What is past is prologue." The message is we should be able to learn from our history so that we're not repeating the same mistakes over and over. And the role of the National Archives is to ensure that people have access to the records that demonstrate how those rights were achieved so that we can learn from those records.
With over 11,000 proposed amendments to the Constitution, and only 27 of those actually ratified, our pursuit of rights and justice continues to be a vibrant part of our democracy. It's up to every generation of Americans to own our democracy and continue this national dialogue of defining our personal liberties.
It is very, very important for all of us as citizens, for all of us as one people, to take ownership of our system of justice. This is our democracy. It belongs to all of us. We must talk about it. We must debate it. We have to continue to fight every single day. If we do not, we will go backward. We don't want to go backward. We want to go forward and complete our effort to create a more perfect union.
Tonight's keynote speaker for our conversation this evening on civil rights and the role of an impartial judiciary is Judge Tanya Chutkan. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, she received her bachelor's degree in economics from George Washington University and her Juris Doctor from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where she was an associate editor of the Law Review and a legal writing fellow. After law school, she worked in private practice for 3 years, then joined the District of Columbia Public Defender Service, where she worked as a trial attorney and supervisor. During her tenure at the Public Defender Service, she argued several appellate cases and tried over 30 cases. 11 years later, she left the Public Defender Service to join Boyce, Schiller, and Flexner, where she specialized in litigation and white-collar criminal defense. During her 12 years at the firm, her clients included antitrust class action plaintiffs, as well as individual and corporate defendants involved in complex state and federal litigation. In June 2014, Judge Chutkan was appointed to the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. She's a frequent lecturer on trial techniques. Please welcome Judge Tanya Chutkan.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so honored to be asked to speak tonight on the topic of civil rights and the role of an impartial judiciary. I have to admit that I have spent a great deal of time, probably more than I thought I would, thinking about what impartial might mean in the context of civil rights. Now, it's an accepted principle of our democracy that all judges must be impartial. But there seems to be a very popular notion floating around that judging is a procedure of some alchemy in which facts and laws are plugged into some algorithm and out pops the right legal answer. I wish. This notion doesn't really take into account our task in cases where the answer isn't clear, where we may be ruling in an area where there is no established law, or where we're faced with a challenge to a law or to a precedent. And this happens most commonly in civil rights cases. So what does impartiality really mean in such cases? Certainly, we would all agree that impartial must, of course, mean nonpartisan and non-political. The Constitution clearly establishes the judiciary as an independent, non-political check on the political branches of government. And in times where the partisan disagreements are pervasive and the temperature of political discourse is heated, it is more important than ever for the federal judiciary to remain neutral, apolitical, and steadfast in order to preserve this important balance in our democracy. Impartial, however, goes even further. It's a fundamental principle of our adversarial system that despite frequently large imbalances in power, wealth, and privilege, judges must weigh the parties' arguments equally and approach each decision without bias towards or prejudice against either side. However, the way I see it, simply being impartial doesn't accurately describe all that judges bring to bear in deciding cases, and this is most evident in civil rights cases. First and foremost, judges, it bears reminding, are people who arrive at their positions following a life of widely varying experiences. When I was at what we refer to as baby judge school, and there is such a thing, in 2014, I looked around the room of about 75 or more new federal judges, and I was struck by the diversity, and I mean that in every category in that room. There were former state court trial judges, appellate judges, former prosecutors, former public defenders, and judges who had come from private practice. We were black, white, Native American, Asian, Latino, gay, and straight, and some combination of all those categories. We ranged from our 30s to over 60. There were Ivy Leaguers, and there were state school graduates, and some of us were, like me, immigrants. I remember then being filled with pride that I lived in a country where this diversity, in the truest sense of the word, was something valuable, something enriching, because as we know, it wasn't always so. When we put on our robes, we're expected to be impartial, but that doesn't mean we become a blank slate. And so the role of an impartial judiciary may be to remain apolitical and unbiased in resolving disputes. But this cannot mean that one's own experiences will not affect the way we think about or approach our cases. Of course, there are those who argue that a judge who is a minority or who has advocated for civil rights cannot be impartial. Interestingly, this argument has seldom been made against straight white male judges. Now, I recall back in 1980, President Carter appointed U.W. Clement to be Alabama's first black federal judge. Judge Clement had previously sued Bear Bryant to desegregate Alabama's football team and had served in the Alabama Senate and fought Governor George Wallace's exclusion of blacks from the state boards and agencies. When Judge Clement, early in his tenure, was assigned a case challenging Alabama's segregated university system, Auburn University moved to disqualify him on the grounds that he had once represented plaintiffs in a civil rights case and that he knew one of the lawyers, which was not uncommon in Birmingham. This move was widely viewed as an attempt to prevent an African-American judge from hearing a civil rights case. Judge Clement refused to recuse himself, but eventually the 11th Circuit ultimately ruled that he should not have heard the case. Judge Clement went on to become a deeply respected and much admired chief judge in Birmingham. More recently, in 2011, parties asked a federal judge in San Francisco to vacate the ruling of Chief Judge Vaughn Walker in the Proposition 8 gay marriage case. Now, Judge Walker was a Republican appointee whose nomination had been opposed because of his perceived insensitivity to gay rights. After Judge Walker publicly came out as gay, the parties argued that because Judge Walker was gay, he could not only not be impartial, but indeed was biased because of the possibility that he might one day want to marry his longtime partner. This time, however, the court recognized the absurdity and the profound disrespect inherent in such a motion and denied the request to vacate Judge Walker's decision. I think about my former office mate at the Public Defender's Office, Robert Wilkins, who is now a judge on the D.C. Circuit, and he was previously on my court, the District Court. When Judge Wilkins was a young lawyer at the Public Defender's Office, he sued the Maryland State Police for illegally stopping and searching the car in which he and several family members were traveling back from a funeral. That case became one of the first racial profiling cases. To anyone who might think that because of that experience, Judge Wilkins could not be fair and impartial to law enforcement, I would tell you that there are numerous criminal defendants and plaintiffs who would beg to differ, and they would scoff at that notion. And how many of you remember who it was who argued for the federal government against the plaintiffs in the landmark case of Miranda versus Arizona, which established Miranda rights? It was then Solicitor General Thurgood Marshall, a legendary civil rights lawyer who, before taking the bench. We expect that lawyers will put aside their personal beliefs in advocating for their clients. Why then should judges not be presumed to do the same? The notion that a judge cannot fairly decide the case before them because of their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their gender, their national origin, or any other aspect of their background is not only wrong, but it is not borne out by the evidence. Indeed, the country's judicial branch is stronger because of the diversity of the bench. Take, for example, the 2009 case, Supreme Court case of Safford Unified School District versus Reading, which involved the strip search of a 13-year-old girl by school employees. After the opinion came out, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg noted that her 8 male colleagues at the time on the court, and I quote, have never been a 13-year-old girl. It's a very sensitive age for a girl. I don't think that my colleagues, some of them, quite understood. You can be sure that Justice Ginsburg helped them to understand. All judges, all of us, benefit from the diverse backgrounds and experiences of their colleagues. So impartiality cannot mean erasing what we have learned from our own professional and life experiences or ignoring the real life experiences of the parties and the societal impacts of our decisions. In Obergefell, I always mess that one up, which is one of the gay marriage cases, the Supreme Court decision finding same-sex marriage bans unconstitutional, Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote of gay men and women that it would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right. When writing these words, Justice Kennedy didn't ignore the real-world impact of this court's ruling, but instead chose to consider the perspective of those affected by it. And I'm similarly reminded of a recent concurring opinion by Fourth Circuit Judge Andre Davis, who in the case of G.G. versus Gloucester County School Board, the so-called transgender bathroom case, wrote the following: G.G.'s case is about much more than bathrooms. It's about a boy asking his school to treat him like any other boy. It's about protecting the rights of transgender people in public spaces and not forcing them to exist on the margins. It's about governmental validation of the existence and experiences of transgender people, as well as a simple recognition of their humanity. His case is part of a larger movement that is redefining and broadening the scope of civil and human rights so that they extend to a vulnerable group that has traditionally been unrecognized, unrepresented, and unprotected. Judge Davis recognized what we all must, that being impartial and unbiased and truly giving each side an equal opportunity to present their case requires thinking carefully about the societal context in which each case arises and considering the impact that it might have. Civil rights cases today aren't the same as those from 60 or 100 years ago, and will no doubt be different in the future. When parties litigate civil rights cases, whether asking for something unprecedented or not, they deserve no less than an impartial judiciary, but they also deserve more. They deserve a judiciary willing and able to understand the import and the consequences of our rulings without fear of repercussion. Every day, I am grateful to be part of such a judiciary. Thank you.
In our first session, our panelists will look at the civil rights movement in the 1960s and compare it to what is happening today. Our moderator this evening is A'Lelia Bundles, author and journalist. A'Lelia Bundles chairs the board of the National Archives Foundation and is vice chairman of Columbia University's Board of Trustees. She's a member of the advisory board of the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women and Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Ms. Bundles is at work on her 5th book. If only she would finish this book. The Joy Goddess of Harlem, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, a biography of her great-grandmother. And she's been working on it for as long as I have known A'Lelia. Madam Walker's parties and arts patronage helped define that era. On her own ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, a New York Times notable book, has been optioned for Zero Gravity Management for a 10-part television series starring Oscar winner Octavia Spencer. A'Lelia was a network television news executive and producer for 30 years at NBC News and then at ABC News, where she was the Washington, D.C. Deputy Bureau Chief and Director of Talent Development. Her articles and essays have been published in the New York Times Book Review, Parade, Ms., O Magazine, and Essence. An accomplished public speaker and MC, she has appeared at universities, corporations, and book festivals, as well as on ABC, CBS, NBC, NPR, PBS, and BBC, and on our YouTube channel. She has served as an advisor for numerous documentaries, biographies, scholarly papers, and history texts. A recipient of an Emmy and a DuPont Gold Baton, she has participated in residencies at Yaddo and the McDowell Colony, trying to finish that book, which is almost done. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard College and received a master's degree from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, a member of Phi Beta Kappa and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please welcome A'Lelia Bundles and the panel.
Thank you, David. We're going to shorten that the next time. Good evening. evening, everyone. And good evening to those of you who are watching us on the National Archives YouTube channel. And thank you, Judge Chutkan. That was just a perfect scene setter for what we're going to be talking about this evening. I'm so pleased to be joined by these amazing panelists: Congressman Clyburn, representative from South Carolina's 6th Congressional District; Derek Kayango, CEO of the National Center for Civil Rights and Human Rights in Atlanta; Joyce Ladner, civil rights activist, educator, and educator and many other things, and my Facebook friend; and Cortland Cox, who's board president of the SNCC Legacy Project. So I know that this is going to be an enlightening conversation. There are many ways to define civil rights. In 2017, it can mean everything from voting rights, reproductive rights, and access to health care, to gun rights, freedom of speech, and quality education. Tonight and tomorrow, you'll hear voices from across the political spectrum on many topics. And as our Amending America exhibition shows, Americans have been debating and discussing these issues since the colonial era. It's significant, I think, that the full title of the conference is Conversations on Rights and Justice, Building a More Perfect Union. It's also significant that we're in the same building that houses not just the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, as the archivist reminded us earlier, but also the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and various Supreme Court decisions that have both strengthened and diluted various civil rights. For those who understand history and who pay attention to current events, it seems as if we are living in the midst of a gigantic civics education on democracy. This evening's distinguished panelists bring a range of experiences that allow us to focus on civil rights and human rights movements from the mid-20th century to today. You will find their bios, impressive bios, in the program. And I'd just like to add that those of us on stage are both participants and beneficiaries of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. About myself, since I'm not really going to be talking about myself tonight because we want to hear them, I'm just going to add this perspective and really kind of a nod to what Judge Chutkan said, that we are the sum of our experiences. I was born 6 months before Board versus Board of Education was argued before the Supreme Court, and 2 years before the decision was handed down. I entered college in 1970, the year women employees sued Newsweek for gender discrimination. So those are among some of the civil rights milestones that opened doors for me and for which I am a beneficiary. But it's also true that discriminatory federal housing laws prevented my college-educated, full-time employed business executive parents from securing a mortgage from a commercial bank when they built our new home in Indianapolis in the 1950s. So as Judge Chutkan says, we are the sum of our parts. We will have the benefit of the wisdom of those who are here with us tonight. So we'll get started. Let's start with Congressman Clyburn. Congressman Clyburn, among other things, was a school teacher before he entered Congress, and he brings an unusual and a unique perspective of those of us who are here today. And civil rights, how would you define civil rights? Is it civil rights as we traditionally think of it? Does it include education, health care, other things? What are civil rights today?
Well, all of the above. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Now, I was a school teacher long time before coming to Congress. I started out my professional career as a public school teacher, which I did for 3 years. But that was way back in 1961 and 2. So I happen to have been a student in high school when the Brown decision came down. So I've been around this a long time. I think that one of the biggest mistakes, if not the biggest mistake we make in this, well, in our society, is the notion that our society moves on a linear plane. We tend to think that things happen on day one and they go to day two to day three. We tend to feel that once something is accomplished, we go to the next thing and you never have to worry about that again. That is the error that we make. If you just think about civil rights and the laws, the 1866 Civil Rights Act, it's probably the most powerful Civil Rights Act ever. Most of the litigation in the 60s grew from the 1866 Civil Rights Act. In spite of that, we had Plessy versus Ferguson, a Supreme Court decision in 1896 that declared separate but equal as being the law of the land. Then we get to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. But I think that if you look at everything that we do, let's look at healthcare. Martin Luther King Jr., in a speech given in 1966 at a human rights conference, said this: of all the forms of inequality, the injustices in healthcare are the most egregious and inhumane. He said that in 1966. So on the day that we passed the Affordable Care Act, I happened to have been the majority whip at the time. It was my job to get the votes. We found out early afternoon that we had the votes. And so we all began to prepare our speeches on the floor. When I went to the floor, I said this, that I viewed the Affordable Care Act as a Civil Rights Act of the 21st century. And if you look at the Affordable Care Act and read it for what it is, it outlaws discrimination against sick people. We've had, we think about it, all the other stuff, ethnicity, we think about gender, preferences, but the law allowed, until we passed the Affordable Care Act, the law allowed insurance companies to say to a woman with breast cancer or a man with prostate cancer that we can no longer cover you after your second or third treatment. And so, to me, nothing could be more egregious than sending a letter to a cancer victim that you've used up your lifetime of benefits. Nothing, to me, can be more inhumane than saying to a family that in spite of all of your insurance payments over the year, this child that you just gave birth to has got diabetes and cannot be brought onto your insurance policy. What could be more inhumane than that? So the Civil Rights, the Affordable Care Act, to me, was the Civil Rights Act of the 21st century. Now, Brown versus Board of Education was about education. But I don't think that we have ever talked about civil rights and stuff without in some way making some references. All the courts, the judges, go back to Brown v. Board of Education for any number of decisions that it makes in any number of fields, not just education. So I believe that the day will come in the not too distant future, irrespective of what happens tomorrow morning, and when my friends on the other side of the Capitol roll out their whatever it is they're going to call it. I think that as best you can tell, if you look at it, it's going to be what I call the regular movement of our society, and that is, rather than moving on the linear plane, our society is always moving like a pendulum on the clock. It goes left for a while, and then it goes back right for for a while. And then it goes back to the left. And repeat that over and over again. You go back through all of the history of the country. Let's just look at the time since we've put a limitation on the term of presidents, which came with Franklin Roosevelt. If you look at all of the elections we've had since that limitation was determined, we have changed from left to right, right to left, every 8 years, save 2. Jimmy Carter's 4 years, and then Reagan, first Bush, 12 years. Every other time, every 8 years, you've gone from left to right, back left again. So in 2008, the results of the election gave us the Affordable Care Act. The results of the election 8 years later is now going to give us something we found out in the morning. But what I'll guarantee you this is it will move us from left back to right. And then we'll have to wait on another election to start back left again. It repeats itself all the time, so we never, ever, are ever going to get to the end of this thing we call civil rights, in my opinion.
Thank you. So Dr. Ladner, in a way that tees up what I wanted to ask you about, that each generation has its own battles, and my reading of your history is that part of the reason you became an activist, among the reasons, was the murder of Emmett Till. You went through that period and you saw the civil rights movement spawning other movements. So talk to us about that.
I was born in 1943 in Mississippi. And on just about the end of World War II, that was important because so many of our parents, African-American kids' parents and grandparents, had fought in either World War I. My Uncle Archie fought in World War I in Paris, and in World War II, where my father was military but never saw active duty. Never saw war. They went abroad to fight for democracy. It was something they believed in quite greatly. They returned home with the expectation that that same democracy would come to them. It did not. They sat by, not sat by, but they observed the expansion of the American economy in the form of suburbanization of America, the expanded industrialization. The GI Bill provided many, many men with education. You might ask, well, why didn't the black men take advantage of it? The colleges were segregated. And if there was no college near your hometown, you couldn't go to school. That prevented a lot of African-American men from taking advantage of the GI Bill. Come 1954, I remember that I believe it's the Jackson Daily News, ran a headline on May 18th, 1954, said in big, bold lettering, Black Monday, because it was considered, the Supreme Court decision that outlawed school segregation was considered by the ruling people to be a horrible thing because they believed in segregation. And for African Americans, I remember my parents, grandparents, talking about, well, we'll get better schools now. And that is exactly what happened. What happened was that in Forest County, Hattiesburg, where I grew up, we kids in the county, there were 3 schools in the county, different communities, spread out over maybe 25 miles. And the Board of Education built one large attendance center, school, elementary to high school, through high school. And we had a new big school and a gym, but there was no desegregation. We got the same hand-me-down books from Hattiesburg High School. I'd gotten hand-me-down books after 4 or 5 years, however many, they had these stickers in, and each year you wrote your name and what year it was that you got that book. After 4 or 5 years in the white schools, those books were brought to my school. We used to sit around as kids and say, well, I got Mary Jane's book, English book. What did you get? Who has her math book? And so on and on. But the books were old. They were heavily worn. And we never got new books at all. We had no lab equipment. My science teacher, when I ordered his own equipment, and on and on. But once we got that new school, and that was the response all over Mississippi and many places throughout the South, that to stave off desegregation, build new schools that would be equal, but not desegregated. I liked the all-black school because it was my community. I could walk to school. I'm not saying that I preferred it to a desegregated school. I don't know what that would have been like. But I did like the fact that I had teachers who cared deeply about my personal progress, so much that Miss Jackson would come to my home to talk to my mother about my sisters and my progress at school. But I longed for the day that we would have a school equivalent to Hattiesburg High School, because our school did not in any way measure up. I longed for the day that we would have a library, a public library. And when I went to school when I was 3.5 years old. My first teacher, I guess they would call that pre-K now. And I was in pre-K and K, 3.5 and 4 years old. Then I got skipped to first grade when I was still 4, I think. Anyway, Miss Jackson had the responsibility for being the librarian for all of the school. Now, she had one bookcase and a $100 budget annually for books. I used to long to walk those steps up the steps to Hattiesburg Public Library, big, imposing Corinthian columns and so on. Years later, by the way, I went in there and they didn't have anything worth. It was awful. A lot of garden clubs and such things. So I could have kept my longing for something more important. All of that is to say that was the background of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of black kids throughout the Deep South. And when I had finished high school, finished college by the time desegregation came, I tried to register to vote 3 times in Hattiesburg. And each time I was denied the right to vote because this man said I didn't pass the literacy test, even though I was in college. I dare say I was far more literate than he. Theron Lynn was his name, and he had a notorious reputation for calling up white people on the phone and saying, come on down and register, or I'm going to put you on the roll, and never passing a single black person. I was registered by federal court order, as was the case with the African Americans who tried to vote. Now, what happened is when the schools were finally desegregated by court order, my younger sisters and brothers went to those schools, but they also saw to some extent, the transformation and destruction of their own old schools. They saw the principal being demoted to an elementary school teacher. At the same time, there was the rise of the segregation academies that now dot the landscape throughout Mississippi for sure. That means that there are very few white kids in the public schools. And the black school and the public schools that are there are starved for resources as they were when I was a kid. Now, I saw all of that going on, and I was an inquisitive child. And I remember when I was 12, Emmett Till was lynched in Money, Mississippi. I remember that so clearly because I feared for the lives of my father and my brothers, and I also feared for my own life because I thought someone was going to come in and drag us out and lynch us. Now, the But what happened is that when I got to college, I became involved with SNCC, but first I was expelled from Jackson State for organizing a demonstration. That was the happiest day of my life. I hated that school because it was like a plantation. The president of the college came over, we had our demonstration, and knocked my roommate down to the ground and kicked her. It was his job to, as the overseer of the plantation, the school, college was a plantation. I transferred to Tougaloo College nearby, the liberal arts college. It was called the Civil Rights College, and I felt I'd died and gone to heaven. And that's where I met so many young people like Courtly. We met over 50 years ago because we joined SNCC. We did. We're young looking, but we... Cortland and I spent the summer of '63 working on the organizing the March on Washington in New York under Bayard Rustin, who was the chief organizer. And King used to come in the office that was so often, come back and see how we workers were doing and so on. And we were on the stage here in D.C. when the march occurred. That was quite a memorable occasion. But what I wanted to say is that we young people who had seen the picture of Emmett Till's bloated, horrible-looking body after it had been dragged from the Tallahatchie River, we saw it on the cover of Jet magazine. And one way or another, all of us decided that we were going to avenge his death. We were his, psychosocial terms, we were his age. At the age where, on the throes of adolescence, when you're learning self-actualization and coming into your own individuality, here somebody had just slapped our aged peer down, murdered him viciously. And all of us, and we were encouraged by our parents who had been in World War II and World War I, to go out there. They expected. It wasn't accidental that we became the activists of when we did and started a movement. My great uncle, who was in World War I in France, said, it's your generation, you girls will have to change things. My father, all the people around us told us that. And Emmett Till then was the personification of all that was evil in the society, and we were going to avenge his death. And that's important because symbols are very, very important. We helped to bring about a lot of change, and I always tell young people who ask, oh, weren't you scared and so on? I say, yeah, of course you're frightened. We didn't want people in the movement who weren't frightened because they were dangerous, but they would get you killed. But we also, we were on a mission, and it was so different then than now. I mean, it was very, very different. It was when people cared about other people, and now people are turned inward and care about themselves first and foremost. So what I saw in the movement was that it gave rise to a lot of other social movements. The great Panthers of elderly people who organized for their rights, came out of the civil rights movement. It went on and institutionalized, and ultimately we got the AARP. We saw the same thing with the women's movement that was spawned by the civil rights movement. In fact, some of the women in SNCC were active in organizing the women's movement. We saw student movements, Chicana Americans, people across disability rights were all spawned. The civil rights movement gave rise to, showed other people who had legitimate petitions that they wanted to bring to their government and to others that it was possible. Where are we now? Congressman Clyburn, you're right that we do go back and forth. But I really, really hope that people are not denied health care because it should be a right. It's a human right to be able to take care of your body. Every major industrialized country in the world has a form of health care available to the vast majority of its people. I don't know why it has to be so difficult here. It's the insurance company, it's the politicians, it's whomever. But I can remember my own mother and father not having health insurance. And my father retired, although he was a highly skilled diesel engine mechanic. He never got a health insurance, and he retired on Social Security. His white friends on the job had health insurance, provided in part by the owner, Joe Morris, of that company. It's not right for anyone to be deprived of the ability to take care of your body. So I hope the Republicans will do the right thing tomorrow.
Thank you. So, Mr. Cox, among the things that you said in our conversation and things that I have read that you said, well, first I will just say this. When you were in SNCC, among the things you did, so it said, was to register 2,800 people in Lowndes County. Very important. But you've said it's not about protest, it's about power. How people are excluded from political power and how they get power is what is important.
Yes. I think as we look at today's political environment, it's been defined by what happened in the 60s. When you look at the political parties that as they exist today, when you see that the Republican has the solid South, when we were coming up, it was the Democrats who had the solid South. What we call the Dixiecrats were part of the Democratic Party. And as a result of a number of things, particularly the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenge in 1964, the Voting Rights Bill in 1965, and Ronald Reagan's speech in 1980 in Neshoba County, most of those who were in the Democratic Party and considered Dixiecrats moved over to the Republican Party. So that the Republican Party that you have today was defined by the actions that were taken in 1960. And the big move was Strom Thurmond in 1964, moving from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. The other thing that happened in the 1960s that was important, Joyce talked a little bit about it, is that those who had no voice or vote, including the African American community as Negroes as we were known at the time, the Hispanic community, the gay community, women, they began to have a voice. They began to have a vote. So that basically from almost nothing in 1960, you now have what you had after the day after the inaugural address here in Washington, D.C. You now have a mass of people who have, since the 60s, grown in terms of trying to put forth another agenda into the American body politic. Now, both Congressman Clyburn and Joyce talked about the pendulum. But the reason there is a pendulum, and it's hard to realize, but one person's problem tends to be another person's solution. So the question of who controls the political agenda is really the discussion. And it seems to me as we talk about, we mentioned healthcare. One person's problem is healthcare. The other person's problem is the issue of taxes and who will get tax breaks. You know, and when we were coming up, our problem was segregation. For those in the South, segregation was the solution. So as we begin to look at what is happening in the country and what is going on in the country, the back and forth, the question is really about who will define and who will decide. That is the big question. Who will define and who will decide? Who will define what is the problem and who will define what is the solution? Because I listen to people talk about health care, and once someone said, well, if we don't have any more of Obamacare, people are now free to choose whether they want to have health care or not, or if they should stop by. I mean, so basically, the question of who is defining the problem determines what legislation is passed. Who is defining the problem determines how money is spent. Who is defining the problem determines what the narrative is. So as we begin to look at this discussion, the back and forth is really the throw and fro of who is going to define and who is going to decide. Now, I think that as I look at what is happening today, when I was coming up, we only really had one center of power. Women didn't count, gays didn't count, black people didn't count, Hispanics didn't count, people who were, had disabilities didn't count. But now they count. And they are now involved in resistance. But as I think about it and I go forward, that's not going to be enough. It may be necessary, but it's not sufficient. Because in order to make a difference, they're now going to have to understand that it's not voting at elections, but it's now beginning to organize for power, beginning to organize to define what problem will be solved, who will control the reins of power, and who will make the decisions. So I think as I look at the 60s, it set the table for what is happening today. That, the players were on various sides. The Republicans looked one way, the Democrats looked one way. But now because of the 60s, we have the realignment of the parties, the Democrat and Republican parties, and because of the 60s, we have a second set of people who can define and decide that beyond what we saw as we came up in the 50s and 60s.
Thank you. So, Mr. Kayango, one of the things that having been born somewhere else other than America means that you could watch the civil rights movement from a distance. You bring a particular set of experiences because of being born in Uganda and now being CEO of a center that looks at both civil rights and human rights. What are the issues that you think we face globally?
First of all, let me say how humbled I am to be here with all of you. It's very rare for a young African boy who was a former refugee to sit between these wonderful bookends. I don't know what to say. Congressman, you are really a wonderful person, and all the way to Brother Cox and my sister here, who is actually in my museum. But I got to tell you something, that what you've just had is a human condition. Ali Mazrui, one of the great professors in Africa, talked about this as the great championship around this idea of how do we get human beings to understand the value of the other. You will never find a dolphin that is homeless. You will never find a lion in the savannah that says, wow, gee, I have a little bit of a spot over here. I don't look like the other lions. What shall I do? Our problem is we have a cortex that tends to think a little bit. And therefore, we define ourselves through what I call two things. One, artificial advantages. And number two, this idea of moral aptitude. So let's pick it up from what they've just talked about. There's a great scene happening in the US where you're struggling for your independence after independence. And in Africa, there's a great movement happening. While you're figuring out what things are going on in the US in the 60s, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana is getting independence in the 50s. And it's really interesting because Martin Luther King flies over to Africa to really find out that, you know what, the Africans actually have put up an incredible struggle against colonialism and they're getting independence. In fact, we did talk about you guys being in Africa during that time when Africa is getting its independence. And it's interesting that at that point, there was this little notion around nonviolence, that you could actually use your intellectual objective to actually fight what was really an adverse and credible force in this institutionalizing of hatred. And so Kwame Nkrumah whispers, I think, in Martin Luther King's voice and says, you know what, there's a guy called Gandhi who actually puts up a big fight. You ought to go visit him. Flies over to India on his way through England, where he gives a great talk about this issue of nonviolence. Comes back, and in the US there's this debate with my friends here, the SNCC people, around picking up arms and fighting against this idea of hatred. To which Gandhi at the time had mentioned an incredible point that, you know what, if we fight using arms, we will never win the battle here. And this is where the battle is, right here. And if we can get our young to understand the power of intellect, that you can actually use the constitution of this great nation to do Brown versus Board, to do the civil rights movement, to do all these movements, it was never because you picked up arms. It was always because you were able to say, are we all equal under the pronouncers of God? And if we do believe in God, as we've all sort of come up to say, then God cannot be complicit in this conversation, in the South, in the East, in the West, in the North. So the challenge is globally, is that religion is back in center of this incredible discussion around rights. Is Allah more important than Christ? Is the Buddha less important than the two? Is the African god, the Mvule tree, less important than Christ? And so for us, in the global movement, we've kindly understood that the silence of Nelson Mandela in jail for 26 years or so was this very point. Yes, in my silence, I will still remind you of how volatile your accusation of the other as being unequal to you is such a stupid idea. And so as we've put up fronts around gay rights, as we put up fronts against religious rights, and all the other rights, the question is are you as human beings willing to understand the other and therefore understand what moral absolute is all about? And so the question before us globally is this. Number one, women, the poorest, least educated, and less respected, but voluminous and ubiquitous in population. We think that if you undermine the state of women globally, you undermine the markets, and therefore our per capita incomes globally shall remain constant and not grow because of lack of education. Number two, the state of the continent of Africa is really in dire straits. And that continent is really going to be the key to the next frontier of the marketplace. And as the Chinese go into Africa, they should be reminded by all of you what doesn't work in Africa. And that Africans, like everybody else, brilliant, smart, but very, very cognizant of who they are, still need to be understood. And lastly, the idea of America and its position in the world. Today, your organs of government, Congress, the judiciary, and what is the third one?
Executive.
The executive.
You couldn't remember that? That's the one you should remember.
Those three, the trioca of those three, are being tested right now. And the question for you is, as Americans, will you remind the rest of us in the world that human rights do really matter?
Yes.
That civil rights do really matter? Because you brought up the subject. And if they do matter, you ought to actually fight for them globally. Your obfuscation on those issues that concern us globally will tell the rest of our leaders globally that you were actually pontificating in the first place and that you didn't really mean it. And so, for an African boy who was a former refugee in Uganda under the reprobate leadership of Idi Amin, who then ends up in the US to go get an education, who then builds a business in this country that is supposedly free and is free, and now sits under the incredible, humbling opportunity of being the CEO of the Center for Civil and Human Rights with Andrew Young, C.T. Vivian, Dr. Lowry, is really where the truth is. It does work. The country does work if you give it a chance. So Ellis Island for us is where the human rights are. Does the Middle East count? Yes, it does. We have great problems in the Middle East. Does Africa count? Yes, as we speak right now, the Democratic Republic of Congo is going through a rough time. Can we do genocides? Yes, we just did one in Rwanda. If you don't pay attention, we will do another one. So human rights in the world are directly linked to the understanding of how the US reacts to what is going on globally. Your resources are important. Your intellectual resources, your financial resources. You cannot let these young kids growing up think that you built this country by tweeting or by laughing or by doing anything of that nature. You built this country through these voices you just heard. And therefore, the absolute imperative is that the millennium of this today needs to understand the power of civil rights and the power of human rights. And so the UN, which is the creation of you again, is where those human rights reside, and they reside in silence. And so will you awaken up as a nation and remind us from whence we've come? Will you take up the mantle and remind us for who we are? Will you be the Americans we've come to love through Alexander de Tocqueville? Will you be the Americans who you've been defined as through Martin Luther King? And lastly, our rights in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, all over the world, and today in North Korea, depend heavily on your conscience and moral aptitude as Americans.
Thank you. So America really is the beacon of hope for others, democracy. And I just, before we'll go to questions in a minute, but there are a couple of other things I wanted to talk about. I wondered if any of you had any response to Mr. Kayango. Any thoughts about America as a moral leader?
Well, at the very end, as you brought up Alexis de Tocqueville, you may recall that I believe the year was like 1822. I forgot what year it was that he came to this country looking for the magic, is what he said. Of course, he really came to study our criminal justice system, penitentiary, really. But he said something very interesting that I think we have to keep in mind as we hear so much talk politically today about the so-called religious right. De Tocqueville said that as he traveled around the country, didn't stay here but a year, looking for the magic. He went into legislative halls, went into the halls of Congress. He just went into all these governmental places. But he said he didn't find the magic until he went into our places of worship. Because that's where he found it. And he said at that time, America is really magical and great because America is good, basically good. And when America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. I think we ought to take a real hard look at that.
I wanted to say briefly that other nations throughout the world have for a long time looked to America as the model to which to aspire for aid. But at the same time, I'm so mindful now that in South Sudan there's a terrible drought and people are dying. And yet, the State Department's budget is being cut, tremendously. There's no one on the international scene coming from this country today that is giving the kind of leadership that represents the traditional American morality. We're balkanizing, not we, I'm not part of it, but I will continue to be a universal person, a citizen of the world. But the nation is becoming balkanized. America First really means that we turn inward and don't have to care very much at all about what goes on outside the world. Now, we know it won't work because, the world is a set of interlocking institutions, whether it's trade, whether it's, government, national treaties are there for a reason. So I would say that right now we're in a little bit of trouble about this moral leadership thing.
There's always been the contradiction that existed in America. Clearly there is no more brilliant statement than the Declaration of Independence. And the Constitution of the United States is always, a very important document and aspirational. But at the same time, and the same people who wrote those two documents had slaves. We have a 3/5 clause in the Constitution. So we have that contradiction constantly. But it's also very important that we have the aspiration of trying to reach to a place, even if, in fact, the reality doesn't sustain the aspiration. Because the aspiration has to be there, to which George H.W. Walker Bush used to say, that vision thing.
So, I always it's always such a privilege to moderate a panel because it's kind of like sitting around the kitchen table. I hope that you feel that we've had a chance to hear some wonderful thoughts. Before we go to questions, I just wonder if you have some final thoughts on present day, future advice for young people who will watch this pendulum continue to swing back and forth.
I think that young people today, I spoke to my son before I said to do this. He's a new American, and I was telling him, he said, "Dad, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm going to give a small talk about why America belongs." He said, "What?" I said, "Why America is important." And he said, "We're already important." I said, "So you assume you're important. Do you know why you're important?" He said, "Well, because we are big." He gave me all the reasons that don't make you important. If you're not healthy with healthcare, you're not important. If you're not educated with all these poor grades going down, you're not important. If your day-to-day life is subject to debate, you're not important. The Swedes are important. In terms of all the social indicators, the Swedes are doing very well. So I think that we need to help our young understand what movements are all about. And the chastisation of them trying to figure that out is not the way to go. It's to really help them articulate that particular thing. So when I hear Black Lives Matter, I see a young kid trying to walk, and you say, don't walk that way. Come on. Nobody walks the same way. So I think we need to encourage these movements and figure out a way to help them understand how to challenge power productively, not just for the sake of challenging power. So that's my biggest worry right now. Are the young cognizant of how do you build a social movement, a regular movement to challenge the day-to-day problems. And I don't think that we're doing a good job helping them develop that skill. I'm dying to do that.
The Algerian psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, who wrote Black Skins, White Masks, The Wretched of the Earth, and so on, stated that each generation must define its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. I came out of a generation of the 60s. The young people today are in the 2000 millennial. Soon there'll be a post-millennial generation. But I think they have to define what is critical to them. And I see it, my job as to continue to try to encourage them and give them any assistance I can. That's what we in my generation often talk about. But I think it's also important to maintain optimism in the face of tremendous difficulty and maintain hope and work toward that. Young people cannot become dispirited and feel that there is no way for them to rise up out of their situations that they find themselves in. And that's the job of all of us.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of young people over the past 2-3 years, and before the election of last year, they didn't think political involvement was worth it. They didn't think being involved in electoral politics, because they made the assumption that Congressman Clyburn talked about as he began this conversation, that progress was to be steady, that you would always go forward, that we had a platform that was going to be built on. That's one. But there was another group who said that we have the situation as it is today, and after you did all these things, we still have not achieved, the freedom that we think should be there. I think all those conversations were going on because they thought they had a choice to do or not to do. I think after the election, they are now focused. They're now focused that, being in the streets is not the end all and be all. They're focused that they have to engage in political, you have to engage in electoral politics. They're now focused that they have to do something. Now, they're focused at a level that is 30,000 feet and talking about policy and all sorts of things like that. They haven't focused on what it'll take to win, what will it take to get out the vote, what will it take to do all of those things. But they're moving in that direction, and I think that they're some of the brightest and smartest people I've ever met. I often tease them, the people who consider themselves young people and millennials. I said, when we were we were 17 to 22 years old, and at your age, you would be considered old.
That's true.
Well, it was mentioned earlier, when I wrote my memoirs, I entitled my book, Blessed Experiences. And it's because of a conversation I had with one of my college professors my sophomore year, when I was engaging him in some pretty, I used to love to argue with him. He's a pretty decent dude. So one day I was arguing with him, and he stopped me in the middle of a sentence. He said, "Now, young man, let me tell you something. I don't care who you may think you are or what you may think you are. You will never be any more, nor will you ever be any less than what your experiences allow you to be." I think that what we have to do as a society, as a country, is concentrate on making sure that our young people have good, positive, productive experiences, and that's what will make them good, positive, productive citizens.
So we are able to take questions, and that's always an excellent part of these programs at the National Archives. How many of you have come to events at the National Archives before? Oh, great. Lots of repeat people. How many of you are members of the National Archives? Excellent. There's more of you need to be members. So questions, are there any people who want to, please go to the microphones if you have questions. And while we are waiting for people, I'm just going to throw out something that I was curious about. So voting rights is something that everybody on this stage, so Derek was not here and too young, but everybody on this stage was very involved in the right to vote and registering people. And I just wondered what you think about where we are now with that pendulum swinging back.
Well, I voted for the first time in the U.S. I've never voted in my own country. So if there's anything to be celebrated is that these fights actually end up with a good ending. I woke up like everybody in Africa who comes here to vote for the first time, and maybe my sister from Jamaica. You wake up crying, anxious, happy, and celebratory of the country's fight to allow everybody a chance to vote. So I can tell you voting is unbelievable. And you guys did a fantastic job. You owe yourselves a big hand of
well, and it's like when you watch people in line, when you watch people voting for Nelson Mandela for the first time, when you watch people wait in line all day here to vote, how important.
You guys won't even come out when it drizzles.
And there's such a low percentage of voting in America.
And some people really believe that the rain and flooding that you had in Atlanta made a difference yesterday. I'm serious. Yeah. It's kind of interesting that you got 3 SNCC graduates sitting up here tonight. I first met John Lewis in 1960. I was one of the original members of SNCC. And you remember in 1960, SNCC was organized, well, the first meeting was in the spring of 1960 up at Shaw University. And then when things kind of got out of hand, we decided we needed to get together and really organize, and we met at Morehouse College in October 1960. Huh?
You were there.
I was absolutely there. In fact, it was the night that I met Martin Luther King Jr., sat up with him till 4 a.m. in the morning. I had a Saul of Paul experience that night. I've never been the same after that night. But remember, all of that was on the eve, not literally, like 3 weeks before the 1960 election. And believe it or not, of course, people are now writing about it. What happened in the aftermath of that meeting was a telephone call that was made to Mrs. King, which changed the election outcome. Because before that telephone call, the black vote in this country was going to Richard Nixon by a big, big number. It all flipped in that period because of Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge's reaction to King being arrested and jailed, and the Kennedys' reaction. It changed that election. And I'm amazed the number of times I share with young people that little episode. I've yet to find anybody that knew anything about that. And never put any kind of connection between what we were doing and the results of the elections.
It's because history is not being taught as it should be.
Absolutely. Oh, I agree. Yeah. Except when I was teaching.
High schools.
To all of you. Well, no, Joyce.
No, I remain an eternal optimist even in the face of this tremendous difficulty. I have always been a strong advocate for those who cannot defend themselves. And now those are the poor of all races, of children, of single moms, of the dads as well. I care deeply about the addiction problem that's flooding the country. And I'm mindful of the fact that we in the black community had just such a horrible addiction problem and had so many black men locked up with very, very long sentences. Thank God we're finally viewing this problem as a medical one, but a bit too late for all those families of the addicts who've been put away, families that were destroyed. I think we have to be a lot wiser about the way we try to change our situation. And I guess the final thing I'd say is that we have tremendous capacity. The greatest capacity we have for building are our human resources. And it's not going to be dependent upon who leads this nation, but what we, the citizens, do on our own behalf, on how we organize ourselves and move forward.
Okay. Courtney, did you want to say anything about voting?
I mean, just one last thing. Again, back to the same thing. Some people see voting of all of its citizens as a solution. Another group see voting of all citizens as a problem. And therefore we have what's considered, voter suppression and various other kinds of things that people make up. It's a discussion about whose interests will be served. And as long as that fight is there, you're going to have that back and forth going on.
Thank you. All right.
Yes, presentation early this evening talked about the thousands of amendments to the Constitution that had been proposed but never adopted. There's some people calling for a constitutional convention now, which would be a real wild card. If there were a constitutional convention, what are the opportunities and what are the fears that the mischief it might do, or something that we'd like added to the Constitution? Any thoughts on that?
It'd be the worst thing
No question.
in the history of the country. If we were to have a constitutional convention today, in fact, I don't know if you realize this or not, but there are movements among states that have already approved the Constitution to rescind their approval out of fear of what will happen if we ever reach the magic number, which I think requires only one more state. A constitutional convention would be the worst thing that's happened in the history of the country.
I agree with that.
I think so too.
I'm sorry?
I agree. I think it would just be awful.
Especially because people don't learn civics in school anymore. The people who understand the Constitution. But tomorrow there will be a conversation about education. We've had a great history lesson here today. I wish we need to give you a reading list from all of the things that have been mentioned. Yes.
I've been reading a lot lately about the economic vitality of our economy in the post-war years, when we had 4% growth for like 25 years from 1950 onwards. And the more I think about it, the more I come to the conclusion that the civil rights revolution probably couldn't have happened in a time when, like today, where we have such slow growth or low to no growth, and the challenges of the economy are such that everyone thinks that it's a zero sum, basically. And so I say this all in the context of my own fears as a young person, seeing, I grew up in the 90s when things were pretty good, relatively speaking, and I was just sort of taught growing up and hearing from my family from the South about my mother integrated our elementary school when she was like 6 or something. And, just like the world that I grew up in was way better than anything my mother experienced and her mother experienced before her. And I just sort of assumed that life would get better. There was just this ineluctable path towards, more rights, more freedoms, more prosperity, et cetera. But it seems like we've gone backwards in a lot of ways. And I think that the zero-sum mentality, economically, culturally, et cetera, has a lot to do with that. So that's just my comment, and you can take that, whatever you will with that.
Joyce just said something I think we have to be very, very careful of. A lot of people will look, I'm not the first African-American to represent South Carolina in the United States Congress. I'm the first one since post-Reconstruction, and I always say post-Reconstruction because I've tried to educate people correctly. Reconstruction only lasts 12 years. And so it was over a long time before black folks left the Congress in the last one left in 1901. Now, there were 8 African Americans before me from South Carolina. But I don't believe that Robert Smalls, who served in Congress for 10 years, serving the state legislature of South Carolina for 10 years, was a part of the first 1865 Constitutional Convention that gave us a modern penal system, the first free public school system. All that came from the South Carolina 1865 Convention authored by Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was one of 2 people who was also around for the 1895 convention that took all that away. And he died in 1917, I believe, of a broken heart and much of his wealth gone. He became a very wealthy guy, simply because the pendulum went back in the other direction. So I want you to know, I can't say that enough, because we had an Attorney General under Barack Obama, which advocated for getting rid of mandatory minimums, these mandatory minimum sentences, getting rid of these supercharges being put on people arrested. We got an Attorney General who announced a month ago he's bringing all that back.
Right. Unbelievable.
And it's coming back. If that's not the pendulum going in the other direction, I don't know what is. And that's just the first thing. You got a president who signed a budget the other day and said at the time he signed it that there's funding in here for historical black colleges and universities, and I question the constitutionality of that.
Right.
That's what he said in the signing statement. Now, why do presidents make signing statements? To put you on notice that they do not plan to fulfill what is in the law that they just signed. So we ought to be in a crisis mode. And so the pendulum is going so fast in the other direction, I would say that we are failing to educate people properly.
Can anything be done to prevent the Attorney General from reinstituting the mandatory minimum sentences? Because they destroyed so many people's lives. I mean, the families, the children.
It will require 218 votes in the House and 51 votes in the Senate, and we ain't close to having either one of them. That's what it's required.
Yeah, I know. But what, and we know that it doesn't help the society to lock people up and continue to lock them up. I mean, of course, it helps the business people who own these for-profit prisons, but it doesn't do anything for...
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the Obama administration got rid of for-profit prisons.
They're coming back.
And he brought it back.
Right.
In the same order, he has brought back for-profit prisons. And I want you, I looked at one of those contracts. When I first started looking at this, you wouldn't believe this, but for-profit prisons, every contract I've seen had a guaranteed 85% occupancy rate. Guaranteed.
But there's this judge who was arrested in Mississippi, I believe.
Well, a bunch of them are arrested in Pennsylvania.
For sending,
it ain't just a Southern thing.
The
longest sentences.
Well, they were getting kicked
Well, I'm from South Carolina, so I'm going to stand up for the South.
So, and this is, I will just say, Congressman Clyburn's daughter, Mignon, is an FCC commissioner, and I remember her work on trying to reduce the cost of phone calls for people in prisons with exorbitant. It's, $20 a minute. So.
Yeah, well, Mignon is my daughter. I don't believe I've ever seen her cry. She was as close to tears when this court issued this decision the other day overturning that rule. It's another inhumane thing. When you say to a person that to call home, if you remember this case started, it came out of Washington.
So I didn't realize it had been overturned.
Yes.
Yeah, it was overturned.
Yeah, federal judge overturned it last week, I believe it was. Appellate court. Not you. Not your court. Yeah, well, yes, sir. Your court sent it to the FCC.
Yeah.
The FCC did what it sat there for 20 years. When Mignon became chair, she did it. And she told me if she didn't do anything else, she was going to do that because she got to know the lady, the grandmother, who started the case. And all trying to hold on to her grandchild, like you were saying, trying to make sure this grandchild doesn't get away from us. Yeah. But she couldn't afford to make the phone calls because it paid $25 and $30 a minute. That's crazy.
Awful.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's ridiculous.
But that's what it was.
Law against them.
So Google that, find out more. I'm going to do more research. So we're going to take two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. And so if you would ask your questions back to back, and then that will allow us to speed things up a bit.
My name is Li Yang. I went to the ACC or other agencies hearing and testimony. And the example you say is for the phone call in the jail. Actually, the whole thing is even worse. Not only the innocent were sent to jail, but once they get to jail, they cannot use phone. The phone is either disabled or whatever reason, not allow you to talk. But the same thing is people cannot talk in anywhere almost, whether it is in City Hall or in County Council of hearings or in State General Assembly hearings or even in some agencies. They just don't allow you to talk. So and our democracy is not really a democracy. So pendulum is the sort of modest, it's really a vicious cycle. So I just wonder, there are major things you can improve, not only the education. People don't really talk about the rights and the justice anymore. Everything is depend on the money. So now we are going to talk about a charter school and privatization. And the jail is privatization. Everything is privatization. And the problem is if you want to be profit about the people, if you have a good moral value, that's not so bad. The problem now is really very serious. We don't talk about this as a society that we want to live in, actually. So I just wonder if you can really promote accountability, because now all the think tank is using the number, all the census bureau using the number, but those problems is those numbers are not credible, because the resources are diverted to benefit a few, so that doesn't make any sense of the analysis. Right. Second is, as I say, allow people to speak. You have to really allow people to speak, not silence them down. Otherwise, they would, all the trouble will be covered up and suppressed.
Okay, thank you, thank you. And then we'll take the other question, and then you can choose whether you will answer one or both. Yes.
Good evening. Thank you for the conversation. As a student at Howard University in the late 80s, early 90s, my Pan-African professor brought in the former H. Rap Brown, and it was really insightful for him to give his couldas, wouldas, shouldas, and one of his couldas, wouldas, shouldas, or if he had it to do all over again, is he said he would focus more so on the economics. And in my view, after hearing him say that, I also saw that Martin Luther King was shifting to that, and then just in general, that economics is essential in this whole civil rights debate. So that's sort of like the question or something I'd like to have responded to. And then also if anyone currently knows the status of the health or status in general of the former H. Rap Brown as he's incarcerated. Thank you.
I'll talk really quickly about economics because that's really important. The marketplace, AT&T being here is not a coincidence, because I wanted to tell a quick story about these corporations and how they develop their moral aptitude down the road. Martin Luther King comes back from Oslo with the Nobel Peace Prize. He comes to Atlanta, and there's a dinner organized for him. And, you know, the way the US works is that you buy tables as a corporation, and everybody sort of fills the room. And nobody bought any tables for him. They were punishing him for all the work he had done around this idea of getting rights for workers and all that stuff. And Coca-Cola had a group of individuals that were at the helm of that organization that called other corporations up very quickly and said, it looks like Atlanta doesn't need Coca-Cola. Because if it doesn't need Coca-Cola, it would celebrate the child from whom we've celebrated and given the Nobel Peace Prize. And if that's the case, we're going to leave the state. That evening, all the tables were bought up. And the event was a glorious event, and it happened beautifully. Artificial advantages in the marketplace do not work. And those are based on the fact that you tell a child that because their hue, the color of their skin is lighter, that therefore intellectually their brain actually thinks at that level too. And that's not an argument, because we found out very quickly that it's all based on what? Your brain, not your color. And so when you give a child that idea that because they're light-skinned or because they're from a particular tribe, as we are in other parts of the world, that therefore they're superior, they get met with the marketplace being very competitive, and therefore they lose down the road. So you're actually damning them by giving them that artificial advantage in the first place. So the new idea is to not argue around these other things, but to say, let's not create artificial advantages for our children to tell them they're superior than other kids because they went to a private school or because... No. Go to the marketplace and compete. And then if you are good at what you say you are good at, then you can actually say you're... I'd never been to a school with a library before. So when I went to Tufts and I saw the first library, I was shocked that you guys had that many books. Our exams in Uganda were graded in Great Britain. And we were compared to British kids who had libraries, who had food 4 times a day, who had electricity every time. We had no clean water. We had to walk 2 kilometers to get water to bring back to our boarding school. All those things made us actually really good at what we did. So that when the Jomo Kenyattas, when the Mutesas went to London to go to school, an A was very easy. So artificial advantages in the marketplace cannot work. So monolithia is the last thing. A monolithic group of employees, all from Savannah, Georgia, for example, can never compete with diversity. It's just proven. So as our corporations think about bringing in gender, I think GE now has this idea of bringing 20,000 women to learn about technology. All that stuff is really going to bring the playing field a little bit more equal. So you're right. The marketplace becomes the place for our next frontier to really judge, are we all equal? Maybe not here, but if you give us a chance, we can compete with you brilliantly. And now look at Derek. I've competed with you very well.
So we actually have run out of time. So this is just thank you all. I'm sorry I won't be able to take your question. But this has been, for me, a wonderful learning experience. Thank you for your wisdom, for your generosity of time. And David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, will give us some closing remarks.
So how about another round of applause for both the judge and our panel. And thank you all for joining us this evening. And just to remind you, we have tomorrow a full day's worth of events, sessions including individual freedom and national security in an age of terrorism, enlightened and engaged education for democracy, responsibilities of citizens in the modern era, and the United States of America, a democratic nation in an open global society. So see you tomorrow.
Archivesfoundation.org to find the schedule.